ever crack open an oyster hoping for a pearl, but instead, it's just, well, kind of slimy and disappointing.
Been there,
Well, John Steinbeck's The Pearl is not like that.
thankfully.
This story is layered, complex, and we're not just talking about the ocean depths here.
And thankfully, we've got these excerpts and Linda Wagner Martin's introduction to guide us.
Oh, for sure. Context is everything.
Because let's be real, sometimes a little context is the difference between a good story and one that truly stays with you.
Right. Like, yeah, on the surface, we've got a poor fisherman, Kino, finding this legendary pearl.
Right.
But understanding the man behind the story, what was driving Steinbeck, that's where things get juicy.
And that's one of the things I find most fascinating about Steinbeck. He wasn't some detached observer. Wagner Martin really emphasizes how much of himself he poured into his writing. Yeah, grew up in California, worked all sorts of jobs.
Really? I didn't realize that about him.
Oh yeah, even studied marine biology at one point.
Wow. So he knew the sting of salt air, the way the sun beat down on the water. He wasn't faking that.
Exactly. And that authenticity bleeds through in The Pearl. Even captures the nuances of Mexican-American culture, which, during his lifetime, not exactly common.
Yeah, not the typical background for a lot of well-known authors back then.
Right. But it goes deeper than that. Wagner Martin mentioned Steinbeck wrote The Pearl after The Grapes of Wrath, which was a huge deal for him.
Oh, yeah, Pulitzer Prize, national recognition.
Exactly.
But also a ton of controversy, right?
Precisely. The Grapes of Wrath put a target on his back for its social commentary. Accusations of communism, even an FBI investigation.
Yeah.
Imagine going through that, all while grappling with the very themes of wealth and success that The Pearl explores.
Suddenly that simple story about a pearl doesn't seem so simple anymore.
Not at all. It's like Steinbeck took all that scrutiny, all that questioning of the American dream, and distilled it into this almost mythical story.
Which is a great segue, because the story itself is set in this coastal Mexican town, but it feels almost like a fable, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
This heightened reality, like anything is possible.
And that's where Steinbeck's skill shines through. He takes a setting that's both specific and universal, grounding it in sensory details. You can practically smell the brine, feel the heat, while also creating this sense of timeless allegory.
Yeah, you're right. And speaking of things that are more than meets the eye, let's talk about the pearl itself.
Okay.
Because it's clearly not just about bling, right?
Oh, absolutely not. It's the story's heart, but in a much more intricate way than you might initially think.
Right.
It's like what Wagner Martin says about the biblical pearl of great price. Steinbeck is directly playing with that idea, but with a twist.
Okay, so unpack that for me.
Sure.
How does he take this classic symbol and turn it into something, well, kind of menacing?
Think about Kino's initial hopes for the pearl. Education for Coyotito, a church wedding for him and Juana, all these pure, heartfelt desires, right?
Yeah.
But as the story unfolds, the pearl's glow starts to feel different, doesn't it?
Totally. Like, remember that passage where Kino's thinking about buying a rifle?
Right.
And the pearl gives off this sickly light, chills?
Exactly. That's Steinbeck showing us how the dream is warping, how the pearl's promise of wealth is actually fueling Kino's darker impulses.
So it's not just that the pearl is bad,
Right.
but it becomes a reflection of what's already happening inside Kino.
You got it. It amplifies his flaws, his desperation. Steinbeck even uses the imagery of the sea, which starts as this source of life, to mirror this.
Oh, interesting.
Remember, Juana sings about the pearl burying them in the town of stones, foreshadowing how this supposed treasure will isolate them.
Which reminds me of another element that adds this whole other layer to the story. The music. It's almost like a Greek chorus, commenting on the action.
That's a fantastic comparison, and it speaks to how Steinbeck masterfully uses music, not just as background noise, but as a storytelling tool.
Yeah.
Think about the Song of the Family.
Right.
It represents their unity, their love. But then there's the Song of Evil.
Which, if I'm remembering correctly, gets more and more prominent as Kino gets more entangled with the pearl.
Precisely. It's like a soundtrack to his moral descent, this constant internal struggle.
Wow.
It's subtle, but incredibly powerful. And this duality, this push and pull between good and evil, it's everywhere, isn't it? Within Kino, sure, but also in the way the townspeople react to the pearl.
Totally. They go from being simple neighbors to, like, avaricious vultures practically overnight.
Which is where that comparison Wagner Martin makes to medieval morality comes into play.
Okay.
We see these archetypal characters, these larger-than-life scenarios that are meant to teach us a lesson about, well, being human.
And man, do we need those lessons sometimes, even if they're wrapped up in a story about a pearl.
Exactly. Because who hasn't felt that pull of wanting more, of getting caught up in the what-ifs? Steinbeck forces us to ask ourselves, at what cost are we chasing our desires?
It's tough, right? Like, we're right there with Kino, feeling that weight of these choices he has to make. With
Yeah.
all this talk about symbolism and morality plays and everything,
Hmm.
what's the takeaway for the average person
Mhm.
listening to this? Why should we care about this pearl-obsessed fisherman from a story written decades ago?
That's the beauty of a deep dive like this, isn't it? We uncover these timeless truths
I'm aware.
about human nature.
Right, right.
Because, I mean, let's be real.
Yeah.
Who hasn't felt that pull of greed, that desire for something more?
It's like that saying, be careful what you wish for,
Exactly.
but on a whole other level. You know what I mean?
It really is.
Yeah.
And I think that's why Steinbeck doesn't give us a clear-cut villain in Kino either.
Oh, interesting.
He's flawed?
Yeah.
Sure. But he's also driven by love for his family.
Of course. Yeah.
He wants a better life for them, which, in the beginning, seems like a very noble goal.
Totally.
But the tragedy is that Kino gets so fixated on the pearl as the only path to achieving that goal that he loses sight of everything else. His integrity, his community,
Yeah.
and ultimately even his own son.
It's heartbreaking. And speaking of heartbreaking, Juan is such a fascinating character throughout all of this.
Oh, absolutely.
She's clearly not just some, like, passive bystander in this whole thing.
No, not at all. In fact, Wagner Martin even suggests that Juana embodies a different kind of wisdom.
Okay.
One that's deeply connected to nature, to intuition. Remember how she begs Kino to get rid of the pearl?
Yeah, she senses the danger from the very beginning.
Exactly.
Yeah.
She's like this voice of reason, but he's so caught up in the pearl song, he can't even hear her.
It's true. It's true.
And that's a powerful message in itself, isn't it? To consider whose voices we're listening to,
Right.
especially when the stakes are high. Are we prioritizing our own desires, our own ambitions, over the wisdom of those who truly know us?
You mentioned Carl Jung earlier. Can you maybe tie that back into what we were talking about?
Of course. Remember how Jung talked about the shadow self? Those darker aspects of our personalities we often try to suppress?
Oh, right. Yeah.
Well, you could argue that Kino's journey with the pearl is kind of a metaphor for that internal struggle.
Okay.
The pearl awakens those darker impulses, and instead of confronting them, he gets consumed by them.
So it's like Steinbeck is saying we all have that potential for darkness within us.
Yeah,
And it's our choices that determine whether we overcome it or let it win.
exactly.
Wow. That's some heavy stuff.
It is.
It makes you appreciate the power of a story like The Pearl, right?
It does.
It's more than just a beach read.
Right.
It's a reflection of the human experience in all its messy complexity.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, there you have it, folks. Another deep dive conquered.
Oh,
And remember, the exploration doesn't end here. Go back to The Pearl, reread those passages, and see what other layers you uncover.
have fun.
You might be surprised by what you find.